welcome back. I'm super excited to be sitting down with Claire Simmons today. She's one of the production designers. She was the colorist for the film. So I'm super excited to take a deep dive into her process. Claire, welcome.
Hello.
Would you like to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. My name's Claire. As Michaela said, I was co-production designer and colorist. I handled the props and set pieces, so I had a lot of fun bringing this story to life.
The thing that inspired the film was the real letters that the script was based around. And so can you tell us a little bit about what you did for the letters that were used in the film? Because those weren't the real letters. They were
hmm
something that you made.
Well, you sent me the reference letters, and I read them multiple times. One, I was looking at the way that they were designed, especially with the handwriting and all the little drawings and stuff. And then reading them multiple times, I was trying to in some ways get into a similar headspace, I guess, that your great grandfather was in when he was writing them and really understanding what he was trying to say. And I like rewrote some of the lines over and over again, or certain letters that I noticed he wrote a certain way. And then I had to do some research on the size of letters at that time, the size of the envelopes, how they would have moved through transit, and then, what kind of stamps would be on them and what it would read and who was like the postal service at the time. Like all of that. That was the letters, I think, were my favorite thing that I made. I think you gave me like three different letters to write. So I made about, I think, two or three copies of each. And then I also made a bunch of different envelopes and just put blank pieces of paper in there so that you had the volume of all the letters. I kind of tried to DIY stuff. I used some acrylic paint I already had to like that was red and blue so that I could get that ink color instead of just using black ink. Because I noticed a lot of the letters then had like colored stamps. I understood how important it was that those letters were as accurate as possible. So, um, I appreciated that you trusted me to to make those accurate.
I remember showing up, I think it was to class the day after you had made them, and you were like, "Look," and I was like tearing up. I was like, "Oh my gosh, it's so good." And I
Yeah.
loved in the real letters, he had done like little drawings and stuff
hmm
of like, this is what our nameplate will look like when we're married, and it was like the little heart with the doves and everything. And one of my favorite things is that you actually like recreated those little drawings in
hmm
those letters.
hmm
And I'm so sad that we couldn't get to look at it as much as I wanted to. So,
hmm
but you put so much work into that, and I really loved it a lot.
Yeah, I remember when you first shared the references with me and I read them in class and I was literally tearing up because of like how sweet they all were. And yeah, that was definitely like my little spark where I was like, okay, these really have to look and feel like the actual ones do, because that was crazy for like a 17-year-old to be writing
I
home. So,
So throughout the film, we see that they're carrying these pictures of each other. Can you like walk through the process of like how you got like same day those like old pictures and the way that you like posed them and the inspiration
mhm.
behind that?
I was making all of the prom set pieces, and then when we weren't shooting and the actors had a second, they came over to the church that we were staged in while you guys were filming in the house. I took both their photos. I just sat them down on a pew that was like pushed up against the wall, and there was a lot of natural light coming in because obviously it was a church, so the windows were really, tall and big. And I was looking up old photographs and trying to figure out what the lighting looked like and what the texture and the color and all was. So I was getting these ideas in my head so that when they actually, had a free moment, I just posed them a certain way. My biggest inspiration, at least for the posing, was to make them look like yearbook photographs. And I took their photos on my iPhone. I just like resized them on Canva, and then I could also add film grain and stuff. Our BTS photographer, she graciously went back to the school. She printed them out in our photography lab and then brought them back. I cut them out, and I folded them up and tried to make them look really old. Yeah, that was definitely a lot of trial and error that day, and I was a little nervous that it wasn't gonna turn out right, but I really love how they turned out. And it was fun to do something day of, like it was a fun little challenge.
You put a ton of work into the prom. So I was wondering what the thought process was behind some of the decorations that you put up.
Well, the main inspiration was Back to the Future, and just like the under the sea vibe. There wasn't a huge scene there. Um, I still think it's really important that it looked as authentic as possible because I was watching another interview for a film. There was some production designer and they were talking about how they leave things in drawers for the actors to see when they're in the scene. So I was like, that's a really cool concept and, shows how much the production designer actually cares about bringing the world to life. So even though I knew that the prom wasn't a major featured location, I was like, okay, well, these actors are still going to be here. It needs to feel and look like a prom. But I tried to condense it into three little sections where you had like the centerpiece with the seashell, and then the streamers, and then the little jellyfish on the side. So it created sort of like a frame, like a triangular frame around the door, to draw us into that space. I had the big seashell, which that was just cardboard that I painted and then dumped a lot of glitter on, which I still find some glitter, especially in my car, even now. That was another thing I had to kind of research of the time, what kind of paper they had then, or what kind of streamers they had. I think I even looked up like if glitter was really a thing then. Like there were all those little details where I was like, okay, well I have to make sure that this would actually be used in the 1940s. So, and all of the sophomores too, the sophomore production design class that was working with us, they were a huge help helping me set up especially. I definitely could not have done that by myself. That was a lot of setup and a lot of props to make. It was still a lot of fun to create and I learned a lot from it.
So obviously we're shooting in the Bidwell house that was kind of already stylized, but you added a bunch of like little details and stuff.
Mhm.
So can you talk a little bit about Barbara's room, what the details were that you added and kind of your thought process behind why you put them there?
Designing her bedroom was definitely my biggest team effort, and I was happy that we had another production designer for that purpose because that was a little tricky. It was a really big space, the room we were in, and I felt like we needed to make it feel smaller and more intimate since she was just at her dresser and then the bed and then like the mirror. So we didn't need, the whole other half of the room. So it was a bit tricky to sort of imagine like what kind of space do we want her to be in. But I think a major thing was in the color scheme, keeping it that primary colors and also sort of like red, white, and blue in a way. And then also almost beach themed, especially for her vanity, like the dresser, since she has that flashback to the beach and there's a whole thing with the seashell. We were like, okay, well, we could kind of design this to look sort of beachy in that way. We had to move the bed. That took like 4 or 5 people, so so the frame didn't fall apart. I think that was like one of the biggest things too. Yeah, we had a lot to design and a lot to create, but we were also in a really, really, really old house with really old furniture. It took, I would say, maybe about a week's worth of planning and trial and error. So it's just a lot of tweaking um, until we had to shoot in there. And then we were like, okay, it is what it is. Which, I mean, I loved how it turned out.
Those like little details and stuff that you added really helped make it seem like it took place in that time period.
That was one thing I kept having to remind myself, even with the letters too. I remember like there were a few people when I was making that were like, "Oh, well, how are you going to age them?" And I was like, "I can't age them because we're in the actual time period." So yeah, I had to keep that in mind too with the bedroom is like, "Okay, well, we do have to bring in new looking stuff, especially with the fabric, I think, making sure it didn't look discolored or old because we're supposed to be like in the time period, things are supposed to look of that time." So, yeah.
I was thinking now we could move on to color because you're also the colorist.
hmm
And I know that we had a lot of discussions about we wanted Barbara to have like the warmer colors and we wanted Charlie to have like the cooler blues. There's one specific scene that I'm thinking about, and it's the one on the beach where Charlie's like down on the ground. Like that scene specifically just seemed to work out really well for color. So can you talk a little bit about what that was like?
That scene or that shot specifically, I remember looking at it and just naturally, before I had done any creative grading and I just corrected everything, already Charlie was on the side where the sky was bluer, and then I guess the sun was over more on Barbara's side, so it kind of took some of that color out. So there was this already this transition from blue into more of like a yellow in the sky. And I was like, that is so crazy that that worked out that way. And I thought that it really worked for their characters because she's kind of drawn more towards home. He's drawn towards the sea and all those blues. But yeah, it was really fun to be able to work off of what was already part of the shot instead of just creating something from scratch. And that's one of my favorite shots in the entire film, for sure just because it already was working out that way. And I was like, oh, this is so awesome. Like that they already just happened to put them on this side of the frame.
Did something similar happen at the reuniting scene where there was also just that happy
Yes.
coincidence that you were able to like really pump up in that scene
Yeah.
also, right?
Yeah, because the way that they had lit when they put the light on the jib and it was way above them on the bridge, since it was so dark out, it was on Barbara's side and it was warmer light to emulate a street lamp. So yeah, already she was running from the warmer light and he was coming from the opposite side where there was some sort of light already over there and it just happened to be cooler. And yeah, in the wide, you can see there's still that two halves that and then they're now meeting in the middle. So that one I tried to blend even more, um, since they were reuniting. But yeah, so that happened twice, which I just think is really awesome.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask about was on the ship, in the battle scene, we were using a mixture of like older footage and the stuff that we had shot, and you were
hmm
trying to blend those together in a way that kind of
hmm
worked. So, can you talk a little bit about what that process was like a little bit? Like, how did you take that older footage and um, try to match it with the stuff that we had done?
hmm The biggest thing I did was for all of the footage that we shot, I added film grain just a little bit to each shot. And so once again, I had to do some research and see, okay, well, what type of film was being used. I don't remember what millimeter of film grain I went for, but it was whatever was standard at the time. And then I just kind of messed around with the intensity, I guess you'd say, of the grain, like how many, specks you could see. So after I had color graded everything, then I did a grain pass. And then I kind of did the opposite thing for the footage that you were working into the film, since that was really, really grainy. And we needed to find some way to make it a bit clearer. I had to do noise reduction and then add sharpness back and then add some of the grain back. So it was a lot of like trying to balance um both sides and sort of find some sort of middle ground so that once again when you were going from one type of footage to the other it wasn't too jarring.
So one of the other things I wanted to ask about was the day for night scene on the ship. One, what is a day for night? And two, how do you color grade for that?
Well, day for night is how it sounds. You shoot during the daytime and then you grade to make it look like it's nighttime. So thank goodness we had one shot and it was looking down on our character and not up, so I didn't have to worry about the sky at all. Because it's normally a make or break kind of situation. I had never done day for night before. I emailed CJ Julian, the color scientist and also previous faculty member at Ringling. And he got on a Zoom call with me and he walked me through some of the process, told me a little bit of what I could do. Um, and that was really, really helpful because it was really nice to be able to sit down and talk with a professional and be able to ask my real-time questions. I added the let at the end of my node tree and then would I worked backwards with correcting it and also working with the highlights and the shadows. I use the relight tool that's in DaVinci Resolve also, where you can change where the light source is coming from to emulate moonlight better. Um, I was also very, very grateful to the Grip and Electric team because they put a big piece of diffusion right above the actor, so I did not have any crazy shadows that would not be there if it was actually moonlight. So, that also made my job a lot easier. Everybody did what they were supposed to before it got to me, which was really helpful. But yeah, just grading that one clip took a few hours, since I'd never done it before.
Do you have any advice for any aspiring production designers and or colorists?
For production design, I think just immersing yourself as much in the world as you can makes the job a lot easier and more fun. I had a lot of fun doing all that research and collecting all of my reference, finding all the materials, doing tests, really DIYing a lot of it. I think you can get really fun and crafty with the job, and it makes it a lot less daunting if you have such a big undertaking like a period piece. And testing, especially on camera, you might be looking at something, even sometimes in the bedroom. I was like, this is not going to look right. But then it would be on camera and it would look fine. For anybody that wants to color grade, you can start anytime. There's the free version of DaVinci. You could also get Premiere. There's color tools in there too. Practicing as much as possible. I was talking to Mason again, and he had subscribed to some service, I think, where you would get raw footage that was shot from different types of cameras, and then you could practice and just do your own grades and all. So you could work off of raw footage. I think the best way to obviously get better at it is to just work at it and practice and just mess around, and you'll end up with something. There will be some takeaway that you wouldn't have had if you hadn't just started. So,
Claire, thank you so much for coming on. I super appreciate your insights and all the hard work you did on the film. I'm gonna put a link to Claire's website where you can look at some of her work, contact her if you want to work with her. Highly recommend. And yeah, thank you so much for coming on. Thank you so much for watching the video. We have some more exciting people coming on, so I'm super excited to share everything that went into making this awesome film. So, thank you
yeah.
very much, and thank you,
Thank
Claire.
you. Yeah.